Hello, hello. Going to be talking about setting up amp sims, particularly free ones. So basically, we're going to be looking at starting with a couple of assumptions. You have a DAW, digital audio workstation, something that you can put plugins onto a track in. Sounds like my noise gate's a little bit too aggressive here. Let's drop that down a little bit. There we go. So obviously, we assume that your audio interface is set up for low latency interaction with your computer. I'm using a Mac right now, using Logic, but you can use Windows and whatever DAW works best for you. The free plugins that we're going to be looking at are mostly from a couple of companies that make excellent stuff. So in this case, Ignite Amps. All of their plugins are available for free. And then also going to be looking at Lancaster Audio's Pulse cabinet loader. So we have some screamer pedals, such as the TS999, TSB1, and then also from Mercurial, they have both paid and freed items. They have the TSC, which is more of a straight tube screamer. So we're going to look at putting together a signal chain that you can end up with a good tone for hard rock or metal. So the first thing you want to do is figure out if you have your interface and other gain staging appropriate. So on the interface itself, I have a knob that allows me to adjust what the volume coming in is, how much gain it's going to add for my guitar. So if I just play, can strum, can chug, and you should be able to see here in the lower left that the input coming in for the guitar is not getting above about -6 dB. So that's because I've set the level on the interface appropriately so that it's not getting much louder than that, and that's because if I play the loudest sort of thing I can play, we can get the meter all the way up and get it to clip. So basically anything just before that is going to give me a nice hot signal but not get too loud. So then the very next thing we want to do is add in a noise gate. For guitar, usually if you want something nice and tight for like metal type rhythm, this is somewhere in the neighborhood of what you're looking for. If you have your gain staging set appropriately, then somewhere around -50, -40 usually is enough to get rid of lots of hand noise. I can trigger it a little bit, but you can see it opening and closing pretty quickly. And make sure that's out of the way of the camera. So good noise gate. If you're not familiar with how these things work, there's a lot of resources out there, but basically fast attack, no hold time, pretty quick release. You can use lots of different types of noise gates. There's many free ones. This one comes with Logic, so I'm just throwing it in. Next up, tube screamer. So I'm going to use the TSC, and this one has an input gain trim. I usually put this back down to 1.0, so it's not applying any additional input gain adjustment. Very important for overdriving a high gain amp, sim or reel. Drive at 0, level somewhere between 50% and 100, tone somewhere between 50% and 100, depending on how you want to color the sound. This is very important for cleaning up the low end of the guitar, making sure it's not flubby. And then the very next thing is we want a preamp directly into the preamp. So simple way to go is with something like Emissary from Ignite. So let me make sure these are visible. So Emissary is a preamp and power amp that's modeled. And it has 2 channels. So it has a clean and a dirty channel, or lead or rhythm or whatever you want to call it. They call it lead here. And then obviously a lot of various controls on it, but one of the most important things about getting a good tight metal sort of rhythm tone is that if you're using the screamer to clean it up and it's pushing the level hard into the preamp, you need to drop the gain down a little bit to make sure that it's not too much saturation from the preamp stage, because too much saturation is going to make it sound really washed out and messy. Usually you'll want to end up pushing up presence and adjust and master, and we'll get to that in a second. But the very next thing we need, since this is modeling a power amp stage as well, is we need the cabinet IR loader. In this case, I'm going to use Pulse. Pulse is from Lancaster Audio. It's actually the exact same person who wrote the cabinet loader for Ignite. They now wrote basically an update to it. As you can see here, Pulse powered by Ignite amps. So in this case, Pulse actually comes with its own IR built in, and you can use that or a custom one. I'm gonna start with the one that they have just so we can hear how that sounds, but basically at this point we should have some sort of tone. Now I can tell that how weak these palm mutes are means that I need a little bit more gain coming into the preamp. So you just adjust. That's a little bit better. Now, it's kind of muddy. So at this point, there's a variety of things that we can do. It depends on the particular amp plugin that you're using. In the case of Emissary, I'd probably pull the presence up, a little bit of bass. Might do something a little bit different, but we can change the shape of the tone stack here. This usually adjusts how the mids behave. So now it's a little brighter. Have the bright switch in too. So now you can start to hear some of the harmonics and saturation in the higher frequencies coming out. Very importantly, the cabinet IR can change the color of the sound significantly. So in this case, I have some Harley Benton impulses that are free. They were recorded a long time ago from the Ultimate Metal Forum. Somebody got the impulse out of a Harley Benton 4x12. Sounds really good. We can get to where you can pick those up later, but so now you can see that the characters completely changed. Didn't touch the amp settings. So it's kind of a balance between having a cabinet emulation that you're happy with the general character of, and also adjusting your preamp power amp sort of section to match. So I had my tone control on the guitar down to give it a little bit more of a rounded character, but if we crank that all the way up, it gives it a little bit more of a biting nature when this particular impulse response. So you can switch it again, and this one's a little thrashier in terms of the speakers. And then the last one they have in this particular set is very bright. So if I went for something a little darker, so there's not a whole lot of low end in that yet, so we might want to be doing something in this neighborhood, pulling down some of the high to back it off a bit, and maybe even bringing in some of the depth. There we go. So now it has a character that is appealing to me, and it didn't take very long to get there, and all of this is free. So there's a lot that you can do here, obviously, with tone shaping. This tone in particular could be good for a lot of different types of things. Depends on your guitar, of course. I have a Schecter SLS Elite with Fishman Fluence Modern Metal. So this has a very clear signal that's coming in, but you can do it with passives or whatever. The most important part is just making sure your gain staging is set up appropriately. So again, just to demonstrate, if I were to push this gain up to where somebody might think to set this when they're thinking they want a really aggressive tone, palm mutes have a lot of buzz in them now. They're not very defined. So single notes that are you let ring, sure, they have a lot of saturation in their distortion, but when you try to actually play something that has some definition with lots of muting, it doesn't work out so well. It's very buzzy and kind of muddy. So if we go back down over here, you'll notice there's a lot more definition now. So even though the open notes still have a pretty good character to them and a lot of distortion on them, you can actually hear the mutes and the lower notes much more clearly. So we could put this somewhere in between those two if you wanted to give it just a little bit more saturation. Now the mutes are kind of blooming a little bit, almost like they expand out rather than just being a little bit clearer note. So in between these ranges is where you would want to land, depending on what kind of sound you're going for and also what kind of genre or particular style you're looking to mix this into. Another important point about that with the preamp gain is that the more distortion that you add, the more saturation that's on it and less definition, the more difficult it is to double track and especially to quad track, which is very important for getting it to sound like it's much bigger. So if you're not familiar with that, you would record the same part twice and not just copy and paste. You have to actually record it twice so that the small differences in your performance each time end up sounding different enough to the ear that they don't sound like one big guitar when you combine multiple ones together. They sound like multiple sources of unique sound. So when you do that and they combine in the DAW, then if the low end is very saturated, it tends to layer up in an even more unpleasant way. So it washes out and you lose a lot more definition that way. So that's another important aspect of this, is that when you're actually planning to record multiple tracks and get it mixed together into something that is a song, then you want to make sure the gain is set appropriately. So again, you start from the interface, make sure that the loudest you're going to, reasonably play isn't clipping, but you want to be pretty close to that in terms of the gain control. And you can check it inside the DAW, you can check it on the front of the interface, depending on what gear you have. But once you get to that point, then the very next step is you must have something that is like a tube screamer if you want to have modern metal sort of tone character, because this will control the low end. I'm on a 6-string right now. It's tuned in standard, but if I was running a 7-string or an 8-string or even something very significantly detuned, then there'd be even more low end hitting the front of the amp. And without a tube screamer like overdrive pedal, it's going to be extremely washed out and flubby and just not combined together well. And what you'll end up doing is you'll reach for either the turning down the bass knob, or you'll reach for the gain and try to reduce it, and it makes everything else sound a lot weaker. So what this pedal's actually doing is shaping it so that this level is hitting the front of the amp really hard, but not for the low frequencies. The low frequencies are hitting it a lot less, so they can retain some definition, but then the higher frequencies are going to still get pushed through and get a lot of saturation, a lot of distortion. So it's pretty important. I can show you the difference between the two, right? So versus. So there's still some distortion there. But now if I were to reach for the gain knob because I wanted it to sound better in the palm mutes, so it's okay, but now there's so much saturation that if I were to combine multiple parts together, they start to wash out and they start to lose their definition, whereas over here we have a pretty good amount of clarity in the low end while we still have a lot of saturation on the high end. So that's the basic way to put that together. I can show off a different sort of chain. So if we swap out Emissary, there's another cool Ignite amp. This one's a preamp only called Anvil. And Anvil is a 3-channel preamp. Going to increase the oversampling so it's a little bit more accurate in its simulation. So this has a clean, a rhythm, and a lead. Lead is the highest gain. It's also the only one with the presence control. And then because this is a preamp only, you can run it directly into the cabinet model, but Ignite actually has a tube power amp emulation. On Logic, I'm going to move my windows around. So you can get some interesting character out of this when you combine it together. It has this additional little panel, so it has the depth and presence like you would expect to find on a power amp. But then in addition, you can also adjust the simulated tube bias and how they sag. You can switch between multiple tube types, and then resonance, which actually adds more harmonics and more saturation character to the sound, which is power amp distortion. That's a different sort of thing than preamp distortion usually. So in this case, we could pick this channel, and everything all at noon on both, we get, so pretty weak on the gain side, right? So we can, if we put it all the way up, it's only slightly too much. So we'd want to be somewhere maybe more in this range. No, it's still too weak. All right, so there's a somewhere around there. So Anvil has a really nice saturation character to it in the distortion, and it has multiple shapes, just like the Emissary did. And so what I would probably tend to do is not go too heavy on the presence in the preamp and let the power amp pull up some of that. And it's a little bit kind of boxy almost. So we want to pull up some of the low end and probably some of the mids, pull out a little of the treble. So it's opening up a little bit. So one other thing that you can do here is you can push your power amp section, and this is referring to real gear, but it applies in a plug-in setup like this as well, and get some of that power tube distortion. So if you see this little input meter on the right here, it's not really getting hit all that hard. So in this case, the preamp has a volume output, and if we pull this one down and push that one up, so now it adds kind of a rounder character almost. I hate terms like warmth and roundness and whatnot, but that's basically what's coming in from the power amps. So by doing that, you can then pull in a bunch of resonance, which kind of just sounds like buzz almost if you get too much of it, but what it actually is adding more and more harmonic frequencies above the ones that are already there. So it's generating new frequencies, just like distortion in general does. So you see how we have a whole bunch more saturation up on the top end, right? But we didn't lose the ability to have a more precise low end. So obviously, you can adjust your palm mutes wherever you want as per usual, and you get the ability to control how much definition you want. Now for stuff that's a little more melodic like that, the too much resonance and too much power amp stage distortion and saturation can lose a little bit of the definition in the notes, like for soloing, so that your ability to have some dynamics or variations in the color of the sound can go away to some degree. And so in that case, pulling it a little bit back the other way can kind of fix that up. So a little bit more of the dynamics have come back there, and if we go back to where we were before, so a lot of the definition has come back up here. It's not nearly as washed out or glued together sounding, I guess you could say. So that's really how those two things interact. The power amp tubes are a lot less of the biting sort of metal tonal character that you would tend to want to adjust and play around with, but you can add a lot of interesting character on top of the biting portion of the preamp if you push the power amp. So presence, very important to keep presence in mind. It's not a treble control. It is not a, make everything bright. Not exactly. So it is adding high frequencies, but they're much higher frequencies. And so what we tend to perceive that as is more so like air, space in the room. So for example, if I put this back at noon, put this back at noon, kind of muddy. Almost like you almost like there's something in between you and it. And if you crank it up, so the power amp presence here is not getting a whole lot of additional air like you're in the room with the thing, but the preamp presence definitely does. So depending on the specific sims and plugins and how they're connected to each other, you may or may not have to adjust something on one side rather than the other. But if we do both, then it sounds kind of brittle. But if you back that off a little bit and maybe even pull this one down a little bit, you get an interesting character to it that is less feeling like it's under a blanket, but might actually cut through in a mix well, depending on what other kinds of tunings and instruments and what tuning this is in, and what kind of song you're doing. Whether you have a lot of cymbals, things like that, because they occupy the same sort of space as the type of very high frequency information that we're adding here. So that's one way that you can approach building these kinds of chains. There's other plugins that we can look at, but the important part is noise gate, so you get nice tight attacks. And you can, I didn't really show a whole lot here, but you can bring this up, this threshold. Every noise gate has a threshold. So if I bring it up to like 40, so you can do very tight stabs. So you can get Genty on it or whatever you need to do, but very easy to control that without impacting your ability to have some sustain. But when you have your thresholds too high on your noise gates and you try to do lead bits, then it doesn't actually impact your sustain a fair amount. So you have to be careful with that. So I can obviously do, leads and melodies and stuff, but if I try to hold off on a note for a little while, it'll die out pretty quick at minus 40. There it goes. Yeah, it's 2-3 seconds, right? So obviously the higher strings are going to be less output than the lower ones. You can actually kind of combat that to some degree by adjusting your pickups so that the side that's on the treble side, the thin strings, is closer so that the output is higher. And that evens out the total output across the strings so that hopefully then you can, have a noise gate setting that makes sense for the lower rhythms, but also then works pretty decently on the high part. It's not going to be equivalent because lower frequencies have more energy, so they're going to bump up this decibel measurement that the threshold uses more easily than the higher frequencies, but it's the basic idea behind it. So that's most of how Rhythm Tone is built in general as far as amp sims go. This is all showing free ones. You can actually get every one of these on kvraudio.com. It's a pretty big site that's been around a long time for plugins, and there's both free and paid ones and all kinds of stuff, and they have their own dedicated page for Ignite amps, and there's an awful lot of plugins. This particular Tube Screamer here is from Mercurial with 2 L's, and mercurial.com has both paid and free. This is one of the free ones, and it's a really good one. It's very, very accurate to how a Tube Screamer would work if you had it in a physical pedal form. I didn't really talk about the tone knob on here, but it doesn't really have that big of an impact when we talk about the levels of gain and types of tones we're going for in metal as much. It's more of a rock consideration, I would say. But, you can always twist it and play around with that, and you can get different things out of it, of course. Right, so just like rotating that fully left and right while a chord is ringing out does almost nothing to the character. It's more about slight coloration in how much distortion, how much gain gets applied to the different frequencies between the lower and the higher strings, right? So that's the whole point of the pedal, as I mentioned earlier, that it wants to let through less of the low frequency and more of the high frequency. The tone knob is actually adjusting where that split is. So if it's all the way to the left, then it's going to tend to not push the high frequencies as much. So somewhere in the mid-range, it's going to have this cutoff where it starts getting more gain on it. And then somewhere in the middle and over to the right, then it starts being even higher frequencies that are being accentuated, which makes it sound brighter. So I usually keep it somewhere in the middle for metal rhythm type stuff. And obviously these amps have a variety of ways that you can play around with getting interesting tones. You can scoop them. They have bright switches. They have different shape switches. There's lots of different ways that you can combine those together. I'm still on neck pickup. So this one's pretty bitey, scooped. But if we take some of the treble out and put some of the mid up while keeping the bright switch, makes it sound more rounded, even though we didn't do anything else to it. So bright and treble do not control the same frequency range. Now we have a lot of definition, right? Even though we took the bright switch off. So there's a variety of ways to mix and match these things and get them to combine interestingly in these amps. These are really really good amps, I would say, especially being free. They're amazing for being free, but there's a lot that you can adjust, and very, very good tonal characteristics. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, speaker cabinet impulse response is a very big part of figuring out kind of a bass sound that you want to go for. Speaker and mic combinations, which these are emulating, and well, not emulating, but they are measurements of. Huge part of the sound. You just have to get, somewhere around what you like in terms of tone, character, and then from there push it correctly with the amp and the setup of the tone stacks and so forth that makes sense for you, that feels good for you. So that's the basis of getting a good metal tone out of a free plug-in chain inside of any sort of DAW. You can do the same thing that I did here in pretty much any DAW. I think that I will probably leave out lead stuff for another time. It's very similar, but we're going to want to be emphasizing some frequencies that are going to help out more so with playing on the more treble side of the fretboard, usually, as well as the capability for it to sound good and still have some definition to it when you play on the neck pickup. So, as you might imagine, that's going to revolve around mid trebles, bright switches, presences, saturation amounts. Those things can be tweaked to allow for getting a little bit more out of where you tend to play leads at, especially if you want to switch over to a neck pickup. Because in the case of rock and metal, you don't generally want your leads to be extremely round and extremely smooth and have tons of saturation and because they won't cut through in the way that you want them to in the type of music that you're playing. So if you switch to a neck pickup on your rhythm setup and it sounds just like a bunch of mush, it doesn't really have any kind of character in terms of definition. Might be great for jazz, not so much for metal. So that sort of thing is just figuring out how you want to allow these elements to interact with each other. And oftentimes, you're going to want to pick a different speaker cap. You want something more warm, more mid-range heavy, less bottom end available, because you don't want it to be something that wants to fight with the rhythm and bass section. And then obviously you start talking about delay and reverb and things like that. So that sounds like a topic for a different time. But I see I have one person hanging out in the chat right now. So let's switch over here. Wasn't sure if anybody had any questions, comments on what I've gone over so far. Anybody? Doesn't look like it. Cool. So I will probably go ahead and shut this down for now then. And if you like what I did in this, feel free to follow me. I'll probably be doing some more streams talking about this sort of thing, maybe going over the same thing again, different setup, different amps. But that is the majority of how we put together a tone with pretty much any plugins, because they all basically work the same, since the components that we're talking about are interchangeable in terms of how you want to hook them up to each other, what kind of signals you need to push into them, etc. It doesn't really matter if it's free or not. They all work the same. Cool. All right. Thanks for tuning in.